Picking up where we left off yesterday, it says the Vatican, or the other respectable banks, remember Calvi's in trouble now, Sindona has been imprisoned, and now Calvi is in trouble, and this Vatican bank scandal is blowing sky high. It says other respectable banks, such as the powerful National Westminster Bank of London, said they would follow suit. Dozens of others promised to do the same. They all wanted to know where the money had gone and pressed for the refunds, which had been overdue for a long time. Their chief target, the Ambrosiano, could not or would not give any satisfactory explanation. At this stage, the Vatican Bank was bypassed because of the general belief that it had little or nothing to do with the shell companies. It was obvious that the Ambrosiano had gone bankrupt. Who had been behind it, or what had caused the failure? Could it be that the Vatican, hiding behind the screen of the IOR, as rumors had it, had been involved in the whole business more than at first had been believed? It was obvious that the key to the whole truth rested with two men, the president and the vice president of the Banco Ambrosiano. They could have named the names of the mysterious persons who had gotten the millions from the Panamanian, or for the Panamanian shell companies. Roberto Calvi, who at that time was in Rome, where he had two quote-unquote vital appointments inside and outside the Vatican, became suddenly unavailable and could not talk, or avoided any further contact because he was afraid for his life. His fear had become accentuated by the worsening situation, the pressure from the Bank of Italy, the refusal of the IOR to help, the obscure menaces of hostile forces by which he was surrounded. These were anything but imaginary. They had compelled him to travel with at least a dozen bodyguards wherever he went. Even prior to his going to Rome, he had already had more than $1 million budgeted for his personal security. Roberto Rossoni, his vice president, had had no such fears. But on April 27th, however, his legs were shot from under him by a professional gunman. The gunman was promptly shot in his turn, and, the gunman was promptly shot in his turn and killed on the same day by persons unknown. The situation had become seemingly desperate. Calvi, after trying once more to contact mysterious individuals of the IOR, suddenly on June 15th of 1982 vanished from Rome. 2 days later, June 17th, back in Milan, the directors of the Banco Ambrosiano voted to strip him of his power. The Bank of Italy appointed a committee to take over the Ambrosiano in an effort to find out the truth about the puzzle of the missing $1.4 billion. Only hours afterwards, June 17, 1982, Graziella Carroccio, the faithful Swiss secretary and longtime confidant of Calvi, had plunged to her death from the 4th floor of the Ambrosiano building in Milan, leaving a quote-unquote suicide note. There's implication that this was not a suicide, but that she was murdered. She knew too much. And it says Graziella Carroccio knew as much as Calvi about his secrets. Not only secrets of the Banco Ambrosiano, but also the secrets of the IOR and of the P2 Masonic Lodge. Indeed, the secrets of all three, and perhaps more. Had she talked, or had she been forced to talk, a whole world might have been made to collapse upon the heads of many exalted people in the financial community inside the Vatican, in Italy, and abroad. It was safer for them all for her to be dead. Now, Look at the bloodshed. Look at what comes of the Vatican's love for filthy lucre, murder, suicide, death. Now, chapter 31 of the book is entitled The Man Under Blackfriars Bridge, the Missing $1.4 Billion, and the Death of a Cardinal. Early in the morning of June 1982, a man was found hanged under Blackfriars Bridge, London, England. In his pockets, there were $1,400. Very significant number, don't you think, since it was $1.4 billion that was missing? They put in Calvi's pockets $1,400, a passport, a visa for Brazil, and several bricks. Remember, we talked about the bricks the other day. They are a symbol of Freemasonry. And it says, also in his pockets was found a list of names. The police cut down the body, and having identified the dead man, ended a 9-day manhunt, or so they thought. The affair had started in Italy in connection with the man's sudden disappearance from Rome, where he had been due to appear before a court for an appeal against a 4-year sentence of illicit export of currency. Less than 24 hours before, his life commandant had committed a dramatic suicide, meaning his secretary. The name of the man, Roberto Calvi, God's banker, former president of the Banco Ambrosiano. The bricks in his pockets had been clearly intended to give a ritualistic significance to the death of a quote-unquote brother. They called themselves friars, black friars, because they were working for the Jesuit order through the P2 Masonic Lodge. The death of a brother who had infringed or who was about to infringe the rules of his lodge. Okay, this is one lodge that takes their oaths seriously. And they feared that Calvi was going to spill the beans, or had already, and they ritually killed him. It says the choice of the bridge, even more so. Remember, he was hung under Blackfriars Bridge. It was all designed to send a message, a very, very clear message to insiders. What will happen to you if you defy the P2 Lodge? Now, black, the first word of Blackfriars was the black hooded ritual dress of the P2 Lodge, used by the numbers of their official meetings. Friars was what those of the Masonic Lodge called themselves. The bricks were the unmistakable symbol of Freemasonry. The list contained names of the P2 Lodge. The authorities, having swiftly discarded the impression of a classic suicide, suspected murder. On July 28th, an official inquest, however, reached the opposite conclusion. Now, here they're successfully covering this up. An obtuse British coroner's jury decided that Roberto Calvi had indeed killed himself. The verdict was challenged at once, not only by the Calvi family and his close associates, but equally by others in England and in Italy. Some accused the coroner of having known too well what had, quote-unquote, really happened. Others declared that the, quote-unquote, brothers of Italy had contacted prior to the inquest. The accusations were never substantiated, although the latest facts in the whereabouts of the dead man before and during the stay in London pointed to the theory of a well-planned execution. The absurdity of the jury's conclusion was so self-evident that speculations about it, having been an unnatural judicial surrogate, were widely accepted as the most likely alternative, except in certain quarters. located mostly in the City of London, the most influential financial center of the world. A minimal examination of the factors connected with the quote-unquote suicide proves at once the absurdity of the judgment of the London jury. Calvi flew into London from Rome just to hang himself under a bridge sinisterly called Blackfriars. The next night after his arrival to do so, he left a rented flat, walked 4 miles along the Thames to a high bridge, although he suffered from vertigo. Once there, he leaned under that same bridge to spot a scaffolding, which could not be seen directly from the top. And the author leaves us a note here. He says, the present author, speaking of himself, Avro, Manhattan, after the suicide could not, as others could not. In other words, he actually went to the bridge, leaned over the bridge to see if he could see the scaffolding, and he could not. And it says, thereupon, having crossed the bridge to a building site, speaking now again of Roberto Calvi, thereupon, having crossed the bridge to a building site, filled his jacket with bricks, recrossed the same bridge, again climbed down a 20-foot ladder level with the water, and in the dark, jumped across a 3-foot gap upon a slippery wood plank, got hold of a piece of rope conveniently floating in the current, heaved himself to one of the poles of the scaffolding, tied one end to another pole of the same, the other end to his neck, added more bricks to his trousers, and then just threw himself off into the void, his feet touching the water of the river. When assessed in such light, it was obvious that the quote-unquote suicide had been nothing other than a well-planned murder. As already indicated, the choice of the bridge, with its ominous name and the symbolical connotations, was the clearest indication that it could not have been anything else. Blackfriars Bridge, therefore, as a symbolism, was purposely meant to tell a tale to the brothers whom Calvi had or could have endangered had he been permitted to break their secrets. In short, the chilling vows which had bound him to his Masonic lodge had been carried out to the letter. As a potential traitor, he had been ritually killed in a special macabre manner, as a reminder to all the other Black Friars that anyone who dared to break them would be made to suffer the same fate. A few days after the suicide, so-called, June 21st, the Bank of Italy, worried about the dimension of the financial impasse of the Ambrosiano, appointed 3 commissioners to clarify the true state of the affairs, also to trace its main links with suspected financial associates. One of these turned out to be the IOR, in other words, the Vatican Bank. And even more interesting, that the IOR had been the Ambrosiano's top partner. The Bank of Italy informed the government of their findings. The Italian government thereupon, July 6th, formally asked the Vatican, via its treasury minister, to accept responsibility for the Ambrosiano's debt. To indicate their goodwill, the Bank of the government, July 10th, encouraged 6 major Italian banks to help solve the problem of the colossal monetary quote-unquote hole in the Ambrosiano. At the same time, it asked the Vatican to investigate the role played by its own IOR, the Vatican Bank. And it says the Vatican, stung by growing speculation about its part in the affair, thereupon appointed 3 practicing Catholics to investigate the IOR's financial links with the corrupt Ambrosiano. Simultaneously with all of this, 2 great British banks, the Midland and the National Westminster, followed soon by others, called default on loans to Ambrosiano Holdings in Luxembourg, which had raised $450 million. Following the moves, the Bank of Italy, supported by the Italian government, told the Vatican to come out in the open and to accept the IOR's responsibility concerning the IOR's repayment of the $1.4 billion attached to the mysterious overseas loans to the shell companies. As a reply, the Vatican then, to the surprise of everyone concerned, denied having anything to do with the quote-unquote shell companies, that is, the missing $1.4 billion. Shortly afterwards, Italy accused Britain of a massive cover-up. Vital information on Calvi's suicide had been deliberately withheld, it said, because important people were directly involved. Rumors had it that the Masonic financial interest had been at work in London before, during, and after Calvi's death. Hence the stopping of further investigations. The case, however, was revived again 1 year later when a retrial was held in London following the majority suicide verdict, which meanwhile had been squashed by a high court. After sitting 2 whole weeks through detailed evidence, the second jury returned an open verdict on June 27, 1983. The mystery of who killed God's banker remained a mystery, hidden, as the Lord Chief Justice declared, quote, in a concatenation of financial intrigues, unquote. This was recorded in the London Times, June 28, 1983. It was obvious that the deed had been carried out by professional criminals. In fact, it was even hinted that undercover work by British and American men had been involved. The suggestion, although seemingly improbable, however, was not as groundless as it sounded. Since the Italian government, in its attempt to penetrate the quote-unquote thick spider's web, spun by the Luxembourg and by its affiliated shell companies in Latin America, was actively boycotted during its investigation. Their officials had even become the target of veiled threats, as Italy's Treasury Minister admitted officially in Parliament. Additional investigations, however, have discovered further links between the Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank, brought more proof to the fact that the Ambrosiano and the IOR had been factual partners. The Vatican denied the accusation, saying that they were without any foundation. Italy's Minister Andreatta counter-accused by declaring that the Vatican had participated in dozens of transactions directed at diverting huge funds from Calvi's bank. Indeed, he added, most of the missing $1.4 billion had ended up in loans to sundry Panamanian and other shell companies. The latter were controlled and were even owned by the IOR itself. The whole transaction had been guaranteed by the IOR's letters of comfort. To further stress the point, the minister then pointed out that Archbishop Marcinkus, director of the Vatican Bank, besides having been a business associate of Roberto Calvi, had been also on the board of the offshore subsidiaries in Nassau. The dispute eventually was handed over to Cardinal Casaroli, the Vatican Secretary of State, who appointed 3 top lay financiers to ascertain the liabilities of the IOR as already seen. Excuse me. The major banks involved in the affair, meanwhile, had met to discuss the Ambrosiano-IOR Luxembourg relationship and their responsibilities with the missing $1.4 billion loans. Result, a cool acknowledgement of a major financial disaster. Default of more than $200 million by the major banks of West Germany, Britain, and Switzerland, due chiefly to loans to the Luxembourg subsidiaries. The 250 banks had lent, quote-unquote, collectively, more than $400 million. As the stark facts emerged and the links of the IOR and the whole sorry affair became ever more apparent, the Vatican began to admit, even if reluctantly, quote-unquote, partial responsibility. Then, when it was proved that at least 7 of the shell companies, most of them linked with Luxembourg, were controlled and indeed were even owned by the IOR, it finally admitted possible liability. Such liability, however, it declared, amounted only to $250 million out of the missing $1.4 billion. Italy then asked Cardinal Casseroli to reveal what the 3 wise men had discovered. To impress upon him the seriousness of her request, she began by indicting the 2 highest officials of the IOR itself on charges rising from another bank scandal, the Sindona collapse of 1974. Not content with that, it hinted that if Archbishop Marcinkus left Vatican City, he would be promptly arrested for complicity. The justification for the arrest was given further validity by the intervention of ex-Vatican financier Sindona himself, who from his United States jail came out with a statement that Marcinkus had received a $20 million commission when dealing via the dubious operations with sundry banks connected with the Ambrosiano. Following words with deeds, Italy then sent a formal subpoena to Archbishop Marcinkus himself, already a virtual prisoner inside the Vatican. The document was rejected, unopened, on the grounds that it should have been sent via diplomatic channels. Italy then accused the Vatican of having intentionally hidden from the Bank of Italy the relevant facts of the Vatican Bank's true relationship with the Ambrosiano, and even worse, of the shell companies. Further, it informed the Holy See that it had found an additional hole of $280 million in the Ambrosiano IOR accounts. All in all, the Vatican Bank was liable for at least $766 million out of the missing $1.4 billion. Finally, we're uncovering Italy has really lowered the boom on the Vatican, has focused all of its attention on the Vatican's responsibility with its connections with the Ambrosiano, the IOR, the Vatican Bank, and the Vatican is having to swallow hard and accept responsibility for this unbelievable financial crime. And it says, unexpectedly, rumors had it that the Pope was ready to go reach a secret compromise. The result, it was said, of the meeting in Rome of about 100 cardinals where the IOR's problems were discussed. Also, it was suggested that thanks to the offer of financial aid which had come from Opus Dei, however is correctly to pronounce it, a powerful, wealthy, semi-secret organization which Pope Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, had patronized ever since he became Pope, as we shall see presently. While all this was going on, a group of 7 Italian banks, in a brave attempt to rehabilitate the Ambrosiano, resurrected the same with a vigorous financial injection and a new name, the Nuovo Banco Ambrosiano, in other words, the new Bank of Ambrosiano. The rescue operation was not new. Earlier in the year, another group of Lombard banks, all strictly Catholic, had drafted a document warning the Pope about the impending disaster, as we shall see in the next chapter. The Ambrosiano, and thus the IOR, the Vatican Bank, they told the Pope, were dealing with Freemasonry. as though the Pope didn't know it. Pope John Paul II was a Freemason as well. It says, Calvi and Archbishop Marcinkus were associated with the notorious P2 Lodge and its shady operations. These were bound to discredit the Church. Prior to and after the formation of the new Banco Ambrosiano, meanwhile, the Milan public prosecutor had issued a warrant for the arrest of two top Freemasons, Licio Gelli and F. Carboni. The charge? Complicity in fraudulent bankruptcy. While determined to indict Archbishop Marcinkus, Italy had simultaneously warned Switzerland of the impending visit of the two top men of P2 Lodge, whose objective was the immediate withdrawal of funds deposited in dubious numbered bank accounts. The Grand Master of P2 Lodge, Licio Gelli, went to Switzerland as predicted and tried to withdraw $60 million. He was promptly detained in Geneva by the authorities. The arrest caused a stir since the traditional secrecy of a Swiss bank appeared to have been impinged upon. Yet the equivocal identity of both the depositors and the manner in which the millions were about to be withdrawn by a member of the P2 Lodge made it compulsory on the Swiss authorities to act. The Ambrosiano IOR had shaken to its foundations the banking community of Western Europe. That included Switzerland. The seriousness of the matter was that the most respected institutions of the Western world had been all interlocked in the Ambrosiano IOR imbroglio via equivocal activities with international Freemasonry, with the Vatican, and with the political subversion in Eastern Europe and with South American republics. Because of such potentially dangerous connections, therefore, the identity of the millions deposited in the Swiss banks had first to be identified before the withdrawal by any potential claimants. The Grand Master of P2 Lodge had attempted to withdraw $60 million from funds which, it was said, had been put there by various quote-unquote associates. Amongst these were sundry shell companies, and therefore, by association, the IOR, or the Vatican Bank, the Ambrosiano, and members of the P2 Lodge. The wisdom of the Swiss caution was confirmed by yet a second withdrawal attempt. Masonic brother Carboni, the friend of the Grand Master, had also gone into sedate Switzerland for a silent withdrawal from a numbered bank account. Carboni was the P2 Lodge brother who had helped Calvi's mysterious journey to London via Venice, Austria, and finally England, where he eventually joined him during a vitally brief period of time immediately before Calvi's quote-unquote suicide. After Calvi's death, Carboni flew to Edinburgh, a notorious Freemason center, and from there by private plane to Switzerland, where he tried to withdraw an undisclosed number of millions of dollars. He was quietly arrested near Lugano, 42 days after Calvi's death, not far from the same bank where the executive had committed quote-unquote suicide across the railway, were accused of disastrous financial speculations. The arrests led to the discovery of an interesting fact. About $100 million of the Ambrosiano had been secretly deposited in several numbered accounts at the Union Bank of Switzerland in Geneva. Following the arrest of the two Masons, Switzerland froze all their funds pending clarification as to their legality. The birth of the new Banco Ambrosiano, meanwhile, had not gone as smoothly as first envisaged. Recondite forces seemed to be at work to hamper its progress. Rumors had it that Italy's insistence upon the determination to charge the Vatican Bank with fraud and embezzlement perhaps had something to do with it. Others than the hand of Freemasonry were also at work. The rumors appeared to have been justified when Giuseppe Del Ca fell mysteriously from the fourth floor of the Ambrosiano building in Milan and was instantly killed. Giuseppe Della Ca was the deputy director of the new Banco Ambrosiano. The similarity with Calvi's secretary was too striking not to be remembered. The more so since he had obviously been flung out the window, as she had been. Ruthless forces were clearly working behind the scenes at all levels of ruthlessness. Those who had suffered immense losses, that is, the groups of lending banks as hopelessly impotent of solving the Ambrosiano IOR puzzle as the rest, stepped up their pressure on the Vatican. Their formality and deference were replaced by blunt requests and even veiled threats of damaging revelations about the IOR's involvement with the shady international dealings. The result was seen when a council of cardinals from all over the world met in Rome to discuss the matter in November of 1982, and an unprecedented remedy was adopted to produce the money with which to pay the Vatican's debts, as we shall see presently. But if the mystery of the Nuovo Banco Ambrosiano and of the IOR stayed a mystery, another no less puzzling one remained tantalizingly unsolved: the enduring immunity during all of this of the Vatican Bank's director, Archbishop Marcinkus. While his immunity from Italy's arrest was accepted as the result of having immured himself inside Vatican City, his immunity from the Pope's condemnation, or at least reprimand, was not. True, when the Pope visited Spain in November of 1982, Marcinkus, as a rule, and an indivisible papal companion cum bodyguard, had been conspicuously absent. Also, that he had been bypassed before the Calvi affair, when he had been mentioned as the potential successor of the recently deceased Cardinal Cody of Chicago. His nomination there would have meant not only a promotion, since he would have been nominated cardinal, but also the leadership of the richest diocese of America. The presence of Marcinkus there, whose reputation in monetary matters had been criticized because of his relationship with Sindona, would have added fuel to additional speculation of financial improprieties on the part of yet another Catholic hierarch. Since the previous occupant, Cardinal Cody, a personal friend of Pope Wojtyła, John Paul II, when he died in April of 1982, had been under the cloud of a great financial scandal himself, accused of having given $1 million of church funds to a woman friend. Wojtyła's papal predecessor, Pope John Paul I, had even planned to demote him because of it. Documents related to the case were carried in his bedroom the very night when he was found dead after only 33 days of his pontificate, and many suggest that John Paul I was murdered on the 33rd day by Freemasons, a number that is very, very significant in Freemasonry, number 33. Marcinkus's prolonged cordiality with Pope Wojtyła prompted more and more people to ask embarrassing questions. Lay Catholics, no less than ecclesiastics, voiced their concerns, at first in private and then in public. Rumors and conjectures, many of them fanciful, created suspicions and even accusations. Allegations of hidden intrigues, of a personal ethnic, that is, as noted here by the author in regards to this word ethnic, apparently Marcinkus and Pope Wojtyła, John Paul II, spoke a common Lithuanian-Polish dialect. Starting over, it says, rumors and conjectures, many of them fanciful, created suspicions and even accusations. Allegations of hidden intrigues of a personal ethnic, Masonic, and ideological character multiplied. Was Marcinkus's immunity due to his potential capacity to provoke a scandal of disproportionate dimensions for the Vatican, it was asked? Or was it because someone, perhaps the Pope himself, had something to hide? These and other rumors, most of them without any foundation, multiplied to such an extent that many insisted that something be done to stop them. Marcinkus's prompt removal would have done just that. As the months went by and nothing happened, cardinals joined the crusade. One of the most prominent, Cardinal Angelo Rossi of Brazil, repeatedly asked the Pope to dismiss Marcinkus. Archbishop Rossi was not only an important cardinal, he was equally the head of one of the most prestigious congregations, the prefect of Propaganda Fide. And to cap it all, he was also one of the 5 members of the special commission charged with looking into the secret affairs of the IOR Ambrosiano financial operations. The most openly persistent hierarch, however, was a no less prominent member of the Church, Cardinal Bennett, currently Archbishop of Florence. Cardinal Bennett was no mean cleric. He had been the right-hand man of Pope Paul VI during no less than 15 years, directing the foreign policies of the Vatican practically until the last days of Paul's pontificate. He had been one of the foster fathers of the Vatican-Moscow alliance. As if this had not been enough to single him out, Bennett had been the most serious rival papal candidate during the last 2 conclaves. In the first, he was bypassed for political considerations by Pope John Paul I, the 33 days Pope, you'll remember. In the second, following John Paul's mysterious death by Karl Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II. Cardinal Bennett, who had commenced his campaign after Calvi's death, expecting the resignation of Marcinkus as the director of the IOR, seeing how the resignation or dismissal never came, began to ask what was at the bottom of the mystery. Also, why the Vatican was so eager to exempt the Archbishop from his obvious responsibility. Once at a Rio de Janeiro airport, when someone pointed out that Marcinkus, as a director of the IOR since 1969, should remain where he had always been, Cardinal Bennett had a snappy retort. Quote, "In the Church," he replied, "no one fills a place forever," unquote. When a newsman reminded him that Marcinkus could not be removed because he was a personal friend of Pope Wojtyła, the cardinal was even blunter. Quote, "The fact that Marcinkus is a friend of the Pope," he rebutted, "does not mean that he has to remain in the post," unquote. The cardinal became relentlessly determined to have the mystery of the missing millions clarified for, quote, "the good name of the Church." Imagine that. Quoting further, it says, "The forces active behind them had to be exposed, whether within or outside the Vatican," he said. In private, he even hinted at their potential identification. Friends advised him caution. They reminded him that certain inexplicable deaths had already occurred during and after that of Calvi's. Bennett, however, a forceful personality, insisted that since the IOR's liability had been well established, it was high time that those who had been responsible for it be exposed. When reminded that Marcinkus had powerful protectors, more powerful perhaps than the cardinal had even envisaged, Bennett indicated that other no less powerful forces would be at work behind the scenes on his behalf. Quote, "In fact, I do not exclude that Marcinkus will be forced to resign his post before the end of the year," he then declared. A daring prediction, and even more, a perilous challenge. A few weeks later, Cardinal Bennett, the keeper of the Vatican's most recondite secrets, suffered a deadly heart attack and died October 26, 1982. He was only 61 years old. Many of his supporters could not help thinking that his unexpected demise perhaps had not been a mere coincidence. Could it be that the ever more deepening mystery of the IOR's missing millions had something to do with his removal? Another enigma, which, like that of God's banker, only time could and would clarify. Deeper and deeper. And this Roman Catholic Church will continue to get deeper and deeper until Christ comes and destroys her. Now I have to ask my listeners a question. Are you in an ecumenical church? Does your church belong to the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches or any other ecumenical council? Is your church and your pastor flirting with the whore of Rome? Is your pastor touting peace and unity with perdition? If so, the admonition, the strong admonition in the Scripture is Revelation chapter 18, verse 4 and 5. Come out. Don't be a partaker in her sins by joining her ecumenically, because her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And isn't it strange? It seems like today, generally speaking, that God's the only one that knows her iniquities, at least among the little people in this country. But it's time everybody wake up. And that's why I'm reading this book. I hope, as complicated as some portions of this book are, that you at least capture the essence of the book. As I've said before, many people, when I tell them the power and the influence and the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church and their part in this Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order, they tell me, Tom, it just can't be so. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have that much money. Well, she does. And that's why I'm reading the book. To silence the naysayers, those who speak before they investigate. And I hope my listeners will be courageous enough to spread the word to friends and family. Get a copy of this book and read it and share it with friends. Now, chapter 32 is entitled The Vatican Mafia Operators and Operations. The Vatican Mafia. After the attentive scrutiny of ambiguous banking transactions, the three Catholic financiers charged by the Vatican Secretary of State to probe into the Ambrosiano IOR connection finally came to a somber conclusion. The IOR had effective control over two of the major Ambrosiano's dummy companies. Indeed, it had manipulated 8 more of those mysterious shell corporations. The debacle had been accelerated not only by the Ambrosiano's latest fumblings, but also by the IOR itself, with its refusal, or perhaps inability, to refund the money which it had borrowed or lent. The shares which it had bought at grossly inflated prices, plus Archbishop Marcinkus's letters of comfort that had authorized the horrendous borrowing, had done the rest. The findings remained confidential. Quote-unquote ugly rumors about them were swiftly neutralized by official versions to the effect that, quote, the name of the IOR had been used for a hidden project without any knowledge of the IOR, or that, quote, its operations had had the resemblance of regularity, unquote, and such like explanations. When more explicit comments seemed necessary, these were encapsulated into images of wronged innocence. Quote, the IOR was duped by unscrupulous international pirates, it was said, or of lily-white ineptitude on the part of the Vatican banker's director, such as that of Archbishop Marcinkus. Such as that Archbishop, someday I'll learn to read, Archbishop Marcinkus had been the innocent victim of sophisticated cosmopolitan swindlers, they said. Pope Wojtyła, who knew the true facts, however, quietly set up a committee composed of 3 members of each disputant. Its task, quote, to reach a compromise acceptable to both Italy and the Vatican. Thereupon, he made it known that he was willing to reach a settlement with Italy's claims about the debts incurred by the IOR. Another quote, it says, the Holy See is disposed to take all the steps that may be required for an understanding on both sides, he said, provided the entire truth is brought to light. Unquote. The announcement had come after the 4-day meeting of over 100 cardinals held in Rome in November of 1982, already mentioned, during which he pledged his readiness to come to an understanding with Italy over the disputed $1.287 billion claim, reduced from the original $1.4 billion. Incredible.